Hi everyone, my name is Mark Moix from Big Mount Studio. We're continuing this Itinerary app series, and we're going to be talking about modeling our data. So we've gotten to a point in our application where the UI is designed, the colors and the fonts are selected. Now it's time to start building the first screen of our app. But where do we begin? How do we architect our app or our project? And how can we start building our app if we don't even have a data store yet? Well, if you're interested in learning the answers to these questions, then keep watching. In this video, I'm going to show you one way that you can set up your project and start working with mock data. We're going to look at our data modeling needs and create classes to represent our data. Then I'll add functions so we can create, read, update, and delete our data too. In order to work without a data store defined, I'll show you how we can create the mock data or fake data to begin working with so our progress is not affected. Okay, we haven't written any code for our app yet, but we've prototyped the UI to our first screen, and we settled on a color scheme and font, such as what you see here. What I want to do now is I want to set up some classes to represent this data that I'll be showing. So I want to be able to set up some mock data so I have something to work with, so when I start building my screen, it already has some data that I can show. Because I haven't built any functionality to add data to the app. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of our project. We're basically going to capture data from the user and store it somewhere. And then later we'll retrieve that data and display it, right? That's pretty much how all apps work. They capture data somehow, or they get data from somewhere and they display it on the screen. There are many different project architectures that you can follow out there. And you can also make up your own architecture. You can have it be as simple as you want, where maybe all the code is in one place. There are advantages and disadvantages to this, but there's mostly disadvantages in this case. And you can also have it be as complex as you want. Architectures have different purposes, but mostly the purposes are to make your lives easier as developers in some way. It might be to make your life easier by not having to rewrite the same code multiple times. Or it might make your life easier by being able to test and debug your code more easily. Or maybe you have many developers working on the same application, and so you break it up into different parts so other developers aren't messing up each other's work. For this app, I envision 3 parts or layers to begin with. We have one developer, and our app is simple enough where maybe we don't need to set up automated tests and check parts of our code all the time. So for our app, we have a view controller. That view controller talks to a data access part to get data and do other things with that data. And then that data access part needs to persist that data somewhere. And there are a variety of data sources out there that we can use or choose from. Now at this point, we don't know where we're going to persist that data, but that doesn't have to stop us from starting to build the project. We can build our app in such a way so that changing what data source we use will be easy to update and change in the future. So why don't we have to worry about the data store to use at this point? Well, in an earlier video, when we were talking about ways to manage our projects, I talked to you about this idea of minimal viable product, or MVP. The first version of our product doesn't have to store data on a remote data store. We can store it locally for now. But later, we may want to upgrade this functionality and put it on a remote data store. This would allow users to sync the data on multiple devices. It could also allow them to share trip data with other people that they are traveling with too. But for now, let's keep it simple and store the data locally. And we'll create the data access part in such a way to allow us to update this easily in the future. Okay, let's go into Xcode and write some code. We want a class that holds the trip data that we can pass back and forth between the view controller and the data access part. Okay, we're going to go into Bitbucket and we're going to go into our repository for our Itinerary app. And then it defaults to the source, but we're going to go down to boards because we want to manage our tasks. Now the last task we completed was figuring out the color scheme for our app. So that's done. So I'm just going to move it over here to the done column. And then our next task will be to model our data. So I'm just going to stick that in the doing this week. Okay, now let's go into Xcode. Okay, so here's the project open in Xcode, and as you can see, there's really not much to the project because we haven't done anything with it yet. The only thing that we've done is we've moved some things that we don't want, and we created a source control repository in Bitbucket for it, but we haven't coded anything yet. So remember, what we want to do is we want to just create a data access part for our project where we're going to store the models and the data access functions to create, read, and update our data for the first screen, which contains trips. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder here, and I'm just going to call it model. And then in here, I'm going to have different models and different data access functions for different parts of the app. So I'm going to create a new folder for the trip screen, the first screen. Okay, and from there, I'm going to create two more files. One to hold the trip model, which is basically just a class with some properties. And then another class for trip functions, which will be responsible for reading, updating, deleting, and creating the data. Okay, there we go. Now, creating the model, you have a choice. You can create your models as a structure or as a class. There are some advantages and disadvantages of both, but for our case, what I want to do is I'm going to use a class instead. Now, I do like structures because when you create a structure, they're simple and they have built-in initializers that you can take advantage of. You don't have to create your own initializers. I do like that functionality, but there are also value types, so when you use them, you're creating copies and passing them back and forth. And I don't really want to do that in this case. Instead, I want a reference type where it's just one class and you're passing a pointer back and forth. So I'm actually going to use a class instead. Okay, then I want some properties. So looking at a prototype, all we see right now is just a trip name, right? So let's add that, and I'm just going to call it a title. The title of the trip. And it will be a string. And I'm putting an exclamation on it because I'm saying that it is required. Okay, looking ahead a little bit, I know one of the functions that I want to do is I want to be able to update this title and delete it. So if there are two titles with the same name, how will it know which one to delete? So what I also want is I want a unique identifier for all the trips. So I'm going to create another property called ID, and that will also be a string. And I'm putting an exclamation on there because I'm saying that it will be required. Okay, that's pretty much it for now. There will be other properties that I'm going to need in the future, but I'm not going to add them right now because I don't need them at this point. So let's create an initializer so I can pass in a title to create this class. Now notice I'm just passing in a title, I'm not passing in an ID, because when I first create a trip, I'm actually going to auto-generate that ID instead of passing it in. So I will say ID equals, and to create a unique identifier, there's actually a class that can do that for you. UUID. And as you can see here, it says a universally unique value. And that's what we want. And we could just access the UUID string, which is the string version of that unique identifier. And if you look down, you can see an example of it that they give in the comment there. Okay, and then we want to set the title property. And what I'm going to do is, because the parameter and the property are the same name, like I could do that, but it's going to be a little bit confusing because it doesn't know which one is which. So what I need to do is I need to put self in front of this, because then it's saying that this property right here, the self.title, is actually this property here. And it knows that this one without the self is the parameter. So this is where self can come in handy. I could use self here, but it's not required, and I'm kind of a minimalist, so if I don't need it, I don't include it. All right, good. So there's our first model. We have a class that is going to store our trip data, and we have an initializer so we can pass in a trip title, and it'll create a class for us with that value. Okay, now we need some functions so we can read trip data or create trip data. So let's create our class. And then when I create functions, I don't want to have to instantiate this class every single time. And I know that when my app runs, I'll always need these functions because I'm going to have to populate that first page. So it's not like sometimes I need to instantiate this class and sometimes I don't. It's pretty much all the time I'll be needing to use this class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create static functions so I don't have to instantiate the class every time I want to call a function on it. The static keyword allows me to just access that function without instantiating the class. So let's create some functions that allows us to create, read, update, and delete our data. Those are basically called CRUD functions because it's the first letter of all those words. Create, read, update, and delete. So for example, I'll have a create trip, and for this I can just pass in the trip model. And then let's create a read, update, and delete function too. For update trip, what are some of the things that I need to pass in to update? Well, I could just pass in the trip model because the trip model has all the data that I'll need to make updates. So when I pass it in, all I need to really pass in is a trip model, because from there I can get the unique identifier as a property, and I can assume the rest of the values are the updated values that I want to use. And delete will look very similar. Now notice for delete, when you delete something, all you really need is the unique identifier, so you can find which model it is you want to delete and delete it from there. So I could pass in just the ID. I don't really need to pass in the whole trip model. So I'll leave this up to you. You can either just pass in the ID of the model you want to delete, or you can pass in the whole model. Okay, good. So that is about it. We've created a model and we've created the 4 basic functions that we'll need. Now there could be more trip functions in the future. For example, we have here read trips, which returns all of the trips that are available, but maybe we just want to return 1 trip. So I'm not going to create that function right now because we don't really have a requirement for it. So I'm not going to create that function right now because we might not ever need it, right? But we know we're going to need to be able to create a trip, update a trip if they want to change the name of the trip, and delete trips because maybe they're done with the trip and they don't need it anymore. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to commit this because I think I'm at a good point. But first I'm going to build it, make sure it builds. All right, good. And let's just commit it. And we're going to push it out to Bitbucket, so I'm going to check that checkbox there. Okay, now we also talked about we don't have a data source right now. We're not reading trips from a data source, so I need to be able to create some mock data. So in the next video, when I actually start building out that first screen, I want to be able to read some data and populate it so I can see how my design looks. So let's do that next. And we're going to work with this read trips, but right now we have no place to read the trips from. So let's create a place where we can store that data. And what I'll do is I'll just go into model and I'll create a file called data where we can store the trips after we read them or create the mock data for it. Okay, here we go. I just simply called it data. And I think what I'll do, I'll just move it up here. And really, this is going to be very simple to start off with. I'm going to create another static property where I can store all of my trips. And I'll just call it trip models. And I'm going to instantiate it with an empty array. An empty array of trip models. So why am I doing this? Because our app will have the ability to store more than 1 trip, of course. So most data that you get from some data source, it's always going to be an array. There's going to be some collection of that data. And array is pretty simple. So it's basically an array of models, an array of classes that hold your data. And this is a pretty good way to store your data to be able to read and write from it. So this will work for our cases at this time. Okay, so here's basically how it's going to work. A request will be made for trip data, and that will be done through the trip functions. We'll call read trips because we want to know all the trips that this user has and we want to display them. And what we're going to do is we're going to go out to some data source. For now, it's just going to be mock data. I'm going to create mock data, and I'm going to populate this property right here, trip models, with fake data. In the future, it's going to be populated with real data. But for now, for our trip functions, we want to populate it with fake data. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to check if there's any data in that variable first. If there isn't any data, then I'll populate it with some fake data. So if there's no trip models, then let's add some. And we're going to add a new trip model. And then all we need to do is pass in a string, because remember the ID will get automatically created for us. So I'm just going to hit enter. And we can just make up some trips. So I think in our mockup we had trip to Bali. There we go. And then I'll just create a few more just so we can get an idea of what it looks like when we start building our UI. All right, there we go. So we have some modeled data, and when we call read trips, it's going to populate this trip models variable. And then our first view controller, when we start designing it, will just read from data.tripModels to populate the table view. Okay, this is good. Let's build it and make sure everything still builds. All right, great. And then I'm going to commit this. Push it to the remote. Okay, now there's one last thing that I want to do, because remember I talked about setting this up so in the future we can easily switch it out to read from an external data source or maybe even a local data source. And this right here is the code that will be replaced. Now when you read from an external data source or even a local data source, maybe you have a lot of data and you're not quite sure how long it's going to take to go out and get that data. So what I want to do is I want to start the retrieval process on a background thread. So while it's retrieving, it's not going to stop the UI and it's not going to stop the user from using our app. So by executing things on a background thread, it's not going to lock your app up so the user thinks that there's something wrong with your app. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write some code so it actually executes this code on a background thread, and when it's finished, I'll get notified when I have data. So I'm going to add another parameter that is basically a completion handler and gets called when something finishes. So this is basically a function signature. It's going to call this function when it's done getting data. Okay, so now let's go to a background thread, and the way you do that is through the dispatch queue. Okay, so basically what's happening here is we're accessing a background thread, and it has a parameter called quality of service, which basically quality of service is kind of like telling the application the priority. It's the priority of how fast should we execute this background thread. You might have some background threads that you don't care when it finishes. It can take as long as it wants, or you want something that has a higher priority and you're saying run this background thread before all these other background threads first. So user interactive is the highest priority. It's saying run this background thread before all others. So let's put that code in there. Okay, we have our high priority thread. And then when that's finished, we want to return back to the main thread and let whoever calls this function know that it's done and it finally has data. And we do that by calling that function, the completion function. Hi guys, I made a mistake here and I didn't realize it until I was editing this video, but that dispatch queue.main.async should actually be moved up into the dispatch queue.global code block because we want it to execute only after it's finished getting data, so we know when the data is being finished. Otherwise, if we leave it here, it'll get executed right away. Okay. Now, this code may look kind of confusing. Whoops. All right, we need one more thing. We need this escaping keyword. So let's fix that. Okay, good. Now, all these things may seem kind of confusing. What is this escaping? What is this dispatch queue? What is this async? If these things are new to you and you don't understand, then I highly recommend that you go back and watch one of my videos where I go over this in more detail. I don't want to go into it in this video because I want to keep this video kind of short. So if these things are new to you, definitely watch my other video where I explain in detail this subject. It's worthwhile knowing because I'm going to be using it more in the future. All of these functions right here will be following this same pattern where I'm going to get the data on a background thread, and then when I finish getting it, I'm going to return back to the main thread. Okay, let's build it, make sure it runs. Okay, good. Everything looks good there, and then I'm going to commit it. I swear this used to just stay checked when I checked it the first time. I'm not sure why it's not I'm not sure why it's not staying checked this time. Okay, good. We have just enough code now that we can begin reading trips, and it returns our mock data. Okay, good. There's definitely more modeling that needs to be done for the other parts of the app, right? Should we model it out now? Well, we could, but we really haven't advanced into those other parts yet. We know that there will be a screen to show the days and activities, but we really haven't discussed or prototyped those screens yet. There are many methodologies or ways of moving along to get work done. One of them is called Agile methodology. And one of the principles of the Agile methodology is to maximize the amount of work not done, which basically means, which is kind of a funny statement, but it basically means to don't do extra work right now if you don't need to do it right now. Figure out the minimum that you need and code just enough to accomplish that task. So we're not working on days or activities, so let's save that for later. And one quick note, I modeled this app to have 3 levels of data. There are days in a trip, and those days have activities. This example is generic enough that you can apply it to any other app ideas that you might have. Maybe you have an app for schools that allows teachers to track tests for their classes. Or you're working on an exercise app that suggests exercises for different parts of the body on different days. So as you're going through these tutorials, keep in mind that this is kind of like general, and maybe you can figure out how you can apply what you're learning here to an app that you're interested in building. Okay, so that's all we're going to do for now. We modeled out some data for our trips. In this video, you learned a little bit about what project architecture is and how you should set up your project in a way that helps you. Try not to make it overly complex unless you really need it to be complex. We also sorted out the app's general groups of data and created classes to hold some of that data and put in place some functions to work with it. Remember, we're only doing as much work as we need right now to be able to build our first screen to show the trips. This will be done in the next video, so be sure to hit the bell icon so when that next video comes out, you'll get alerted. All right, thanks guys.